Good. We are good on Facebook. So we're all set and ready to go. We've got about 1 more minute. If you've just now joined us, again, I want to say thank you and welcome. We're going to get started here in about 1 minute. In the meantime, we do love to hear from you. So feel free to jump in the chat box on Zoom and say hello to us and let us know where you're from. And if you're joining us on Facebook, you can say hello in the comments. Welcome, Ruth from Irving. We're so glad to have you here today. Welcome, Angela from McKinney. Glad you could join us. I have 12:15, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Nicole, welcome from Conroe ISD. All right, so again, I want to thank you all for joining us today for our webinar on empowering parents practical sensory supports for the home. My name is Stephanie McLaughlin, and I am the Training and Evaluation Specialist with Partners Resource Network. Partners Resource Network is the nonprofit agency that operates the Texas statewide network of parent training and information centers. We are funded through the Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs. Throughout Texas, there are 4 projects known as PACT, TEAM, and TEAM. Our mission at Partners Resource Network is to empower and support Texas families and individuals impacted by disabilities or special healthcare needs. Also joining us today from Partners Resource Network is our Director of Statewide Services, Christina Henning, our Support Specialist, Chelsea Rivas, and our Technology Specialist, Zach Hidalgo. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can reach out to Zach in the chat box and he will assist you. For those of you that need a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, you will be receiving an email to thank you for attending the webinar. You can follow a link in the email to get your certificate of attendance. At the end of our webinar, we will have a time for question and answer. If you're joining us on Zoom, please type your questions in the Q&A box. And if you're joining us on Facebook, you can type your questions in the comments section. We are recording today's webinar, and the recording will be available on our website at prntexas.org and also our Facebook page. So let me turn it over to our speaker. So our guest speaker today is Andrea Webb. Andrea began her career in education over 20 years ago, working in public schools as a licensed specialist in school psychology. She has experience conducting psychoeducational evaluations, counseling students, providing in-home and parent training, and coordinating specialized programs. Currently, she works as a mental and behavioral health consultant at Region 10 Education Service Center, providing staff development and technical assistance in the areas of mental health and behavior. And also joining us today from Region 10 Education Service Center is Gracie Whitley, Sarah Untersea, and April Estrada. Andrea, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to let you share your screen and take over.
Great, thank you. What I need to do. All right. Hopefully you can see these things here. Well, I am so thrilled to be with y'all. As Stephanie said, I am a school psychologist by training, but one of my most favorite things that I did in my role as a school psych was doing in-home and parent training. And so it's just a real thrill to be here with educators and parents. And I am going to throw lots of information out there. I know we have very limited amount of time, and so my contact information is here. It'll be at the end as well. And so please feel free to reach out to me anytime if there is anything that needs to be clarified or you just need a thought partner. I want to just have some important disclaimers from the jump. Nothing that we talk about over the next 45 minutes or so is about diagnosis. It really is about seeking to better understand how our kids, how they process sensory input from around the world, from their environment, so that we can better help them cope. All of us have sensory preferences, and so this isn't about necessarily disordered sensory processing, although some of our students do have sensory processing disorders. Ultimately, as parents, you know your children best. And so I can't encourage you enough to communicate and collaborate with your children's teachers and other school personnel, particularly if you suspect that your child might need more intensive supports that can be implemented maybe in a general education setting or more as a more comprehensive intervention approach. So before we get started, whether we're on Zoom or in person, our attention is often pulled in so many directions. So I just want to take a moment for each of us to set our intention, whatever that looks like for you, wherever you are. Just take 30 seconds to jot down or think in your mind what you want to give yourself permission to do, to feel, or to not do in order to be really present for this next 45 minutes or so. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to do. All right. Well, if you took part in that, I appreciate that. When I work with educators and school personnel, and even for myself, I have to talk about shifting our thinking and changing our language. So rather than thinking about, hey, this is a challenging child, I ask people to think, this is a child in distress. When we find someone who is challenging, we often feel frustrated or angry, annoyed. But when someone is in distress, more often than not, we want to help them. And that's true for our own children. When their behavior is challenging to us, it's easy to feel frustrated or upset and then respond out of that frustration. But when we think about our child being in distress and their behavior communicating that distress, it's so much easier for us to take a step back and try to figure out what's going on so that we can best help our child. So we know that all behavior, whether it is positive or negative, is communication. Smiles and laughter, temper tantrums, running, etc. Those are communication or attempts to communicate. And when we see these behavioral excesses, we need to first try to understand what our child is trying to communicate before we can really intervene in a meaningful way. And what we sometimes see as a failure to behave properly is really an inability for the child to express themselves or communicate in a way that we understand. And we also know that kids engage in behavior that we find challenging because ultimately it works for them, right? It's getting whatever need they have met. And we're going to talk in just a second about the function of behavior or getting those needs met. And I mean, we've either been in this situation or we've seen this situation where, we're in the grocery store at the end of a long day, parents had a long day at work, our kids had a long day at school, everybody's battery is completely depleted, kids having an epic meltdown, and we give candy or chips or a toy to keep that meltdown from escalating, right? Nobody has the bandwidth to deal. And our kids are quick learners. And when it comes to wanting something or needing something, they go right to that behavior that got them what they needed. And so we want to talk about how to meet those needs and have our kids using more pro-social behavior. So the form of a behavior is what we see, right? The outward manifestation, yelling, tantruming, hitting. But in order for any intervention to be successful, it's really important that we understand the function of the behavior or the why underlying why the behavior is occurring. there are typically 4 sort of broad functions of behavior. We're going to spend our time today talking about the sensory function. And sometimes that gets overlooked as being an underlying factor for challenging behavior. So we know that the sensory function really is about engaging in behaviors so that that child gets some sort of pleasing internal sensation, or conversely, engaging in behaviors that remove an internal sensation that the child doesn't like, so that they can get back to that sensation that feels good. If we're only addressing the form, the observed behavior, we're going to find ourselves really frustrated because we might get rid of that one behavior, but another behavior is going to come in right behind it because we really want to meet the need. We want to address the function, why that behavior is occurring. Then is when we'll see more success in mitigating those challenging behaviors. And although we're not talking about the other 3 functions of behavior today, it's really important to remember that the same behavior can have multiple functions. And through some of our strategies, we might be addressing all of those functions. When we're trying to discover what the function of a behavior is, we kind of look at it in 3 steps. We look at the antecedent, which is really just a fancy way of saying the thing that happens first, right? We're looking at what happened before the behavior occurred. And then we've got the behavior, right? That's what we observed, the outward expression. And then the consequence is what happens after the behavior has occurred. And that can really be positive or negative, but it's positive or negative in the eyes of that child. Okay. All right. So let's get into the sensory systems, because most of us are pretty familiar with the 5 basic senses, but we actually have 8 sensory systems. And they're all very interconnected with one another. So the ones that we're pretty familiar with is our visual sensory system, or our sight. And that's not just visual acuity, right? Or seeing how well we see objects far or near, but it's really what we see, right? So how our brain takes in information through our eyes, processes that, interprets it, and then responds. Our auditory sensory system includes hearing and listening, and also being able to filter out extraneous noise and selectively attending to auditory stimuli, which you can imagine is very important in a school setting. And it's similar to the visual system in that it's about what we hear, right? And how our brain processes and interprets that information in order for us to respond. Our tactile sensory system, this is often the most recognized sensory system of the body, and the one that people will notice if there are overactive sensory system or an underactive tactile system, because our tactile sensory receptors are always on, right? We're always processing anything that touches our skin, whether that's clothing or wind or hair, whatever. And some of our tactile receptors are more sensitive on our skin. So our mouths, our hands, that's why we see a lot of babies put a lot of things in their mouths, because we have a lot of tactile sensory receptors in our mouth, and we're trying, our younger kids are trying to understand what they are experiencing, right? So not only do we identify touch, but we identify pressure, pain, temperature, texture. The signals that we receive through our tactile receptors, they send those signals to ultimately the brain, and it allows us then to identify that touch sensation, right? Determine how to react, if it's hot or cold or safe to touch. And then we've got taste and smell. These generally go together. Taste is gustatory and smell is olfactory. Those 2 senses are very intertwined with one another, right? When we eat, we often smell the food first. If it smells good, we're more likely to try it. If it smells bad, it sends a warning signal to our brain that we might not like that food, or that it's dangerous for us to eat or ingest. Taste is processed through the gustatory sensory receptors located on our tongue. The olfactory sensory receptors are in our nose. These receptors, these senses are very tied to our tactile senses, right? Because we have those tactile receptors inside of our mouth. And then the proprioceptive sensory receptors, which I'll get to in just a second, because we've got proprioceptive receptors in our jaws. And really the three sensory systems that impact a child's development that we may not be as familiar with are the proprioceptive sensory receptors, vestibular, and then the interoceptive. So proprioception is really just a fancy way of saying like input from our muscles and joints, right? Our sensory receptors are located in our muscles and joints. So these receptors help us to know where our bodies are and what our body parts are doing without necessarily looking at them. It's our position in space. So these are things that help us to sit upright, reach for things, right? All these skills that are necessary to be successful in a classroom. And when our proprioceptive receptors aren't working properly, our kids might appear sort of clumsy. They might bang objects, knock things over, or run into walls or other people. So this system is very closely linked to that tactile sense, right? Tactile input, something like a hug, also provides a lot of proprioceptive input. Our vestibular processing system is this idea of sense of balance. It's located in the inner ear, and these receptors help us to detect changes with regard to gravity. It has mostly to do with the movement of the head or the position of the head moving. And it's sometimes referred to as the internal GPS. So it helps us to balance, orient in space. It affects eye movement, balance, posture, muscle tone, attention. And so, as you can imagine, it's closely linked with proprioceptive input, auditory input, visual input, and those sensory receptors in the body. And then finally, we have interoception. And this is all about the physical condition or the physiological condition of the body, the internal state, right? So this helps our bodies understand and feel what's going on inside of us. Are we hungry? Are we thirsty? Are we in pain? Do we need to go to the bathroom? Internal pain, such as like a sore throat or a stomach ache. So many times if a student is requesting to go to the restroom multiple times, it may not be that they're trying to escape an activity, but rather that they have a low tolerance for sensations in their bladder, right? It could be a sensory difference. Our interoceptive receptors, they really inform our emotional state. Think about yourself. How productive are you when you're hungry? How patient or kind are you, right? So anxiety and things like that can be triggered by hunger, these interoceptive receptions. So our brain receives raw material, right? Sensory input from the environment. It processes that information and then sends it back to the environment. And that information that's sent back to the environment, that's our behavior, our emotions to those sensory input. And for most of us, that process is very smooth. But for some others, it's kind of like a traffic jam, and it causes a lot of difficulty with learning and relating to others. And the interesting thing about sensory processing issues is that it's very inconsistent, like a traffic jam, right? So a child may be able to process their sensory input all day long and then be completely overwhelmed in the afternoon, very much like traffic, right? The traffic can be very smooth all day long, and then at 5 o'clock, there's a traffic jam. In a literal traffic jam, right, there's nothing wrong with the cars, there's nothing wrong with the road itself. That's the same for our students. There's nothing wrong with our kids. They're having problems with the process. There's an author named Ross Green, and he talks about, that our kids do well if they can. Our kids want to do well. They want to succeed. And it's our job as parents and as educators to help them succeed by providing just the right environment. And we can do that in part by understanding, the sensory processes and its impact on behavior and social interaction and learning. So each sensory system, those 8 that we talked about, really fall into one of 3 categories. Each system has either a hyper responsive component, a hypo, or an under type of response. And you might notice all of these responses for the same sensory system, depending on the activity, right? If it's a new experience, we might see one type of response versus a response if it is something that a child has experienced before. It's also really common for to be hyper responsive in some sensory systems and then hypo or under responsive in others. Our hyper responsive students are our kids who are sensory avoiders, right? They have an excessive response to sensory input, so they try to avoid adding anything to it. They become overwhelmed. And the best strategies, and we'll talk about some strategies with each of these systems, is to calm that sensory system. Our hypo-responsive students, or our sensory seekers, these are kids who don't get enough sensory input, so they are constantly seeking it out, right? And we see difficulty with attending to task until they get just at that right level of sensory arousal. And instinctually, we think, oh, we should calm that system down. But really, the best strategies for kiddos who are exhibiting sensory seeking behaviors is to alert the system. We want to alert it in a way that meets their needs and our needs. And so we can alert that system so they're not engaging in behaviors that might be distracting to themselves or others. And what we often see is kids, as they become school-aged, we see more sensory seeking behaviors, right? They have new demands. They have to sit and focus. There's less free time. They have to follow a lot of auditory instructions. And so we want to be, as parents, mindful of that our kiddos are working really hard to regulate themselves during the day and how we can support their sensory needs when they get home in the afternoon. Under responders, these are kiddos who have just sort of a diminished response to sensory input. Like sensory seekers, they need more input. And so oftentimes kids who are under responsive to sensory input, they can appear as if they are lazy or tired, but really they just need a lot of alerting activities to their system. All right, so we're going to go through each of these sensory systems as quickly as we can. These are by no means an exhaustive list of behaviors or strategies. I just wanted to make sure that you had lots to walk away with. So for those kiddos who are over-responsive to visual input, we're trying to avoid that additional visual input. Some of their verbal, nonverbal, physical behaviors that might suggest that: discomfort with fluorescent lighting. And you might see that expressed through sort of excessive eye blinking. You might have kids who turn off or ask for the lights to be off. Eye contact can be difficult for lots of reasons, but regarding visual overstimulation, the child could be distracted by the features or the movements on the other person's face. So trying to process speech, process facial expressions, that could just lead to sensory overload, which then can lead to having those difficulties with conversations, which we'll talk about in just a second. Easily distracted, so having a hard time filtering out visual stimuli. Balance and coordination, particularly when it comes to things like reading and writing, and fine motor, things like self-feeding, buttons, those might be difficult, right? Because the visual receptors are also interconnected with the vestibular and those other motor needs. So some of the strategies that we can do to calm that system down is just rolling a ball back and forth, very easy activity. If your kid has a lot of light up toys, limiting the exposure to that and using what we would describe as simple toys, blocks, things that have neutral colors. Decreasing screen time is really important because sometimes kids with visual sensitivity, when they have excessive access to screens, reading, writing activities, they can complain that their eyes hurt or eye fatigue, headaches, things like that. If the visual stimulation outside, like just with sunlight, is too challenging, or even with like fluorescent lights in the classroom, kids might wear hats or special eyeglasses, things like that. Obviously, we know in Western culture, there's been a thing where people would say, all right, well, if you're looking at me, that's a sign of respect. In other cultures, we know that a younger person, to show respect, doesn't look at an older person in the eye. We never want to force or demand eye contact. And then providing a visual aid can be helpful so that the child doesn't have to filter out all of the other visual information. They can see exactly what they need to do. And that can help with, we use those in school settings for tasks during the day. Those can be done at home for the tasks that need to be done at home. When we are looking at auditory sensitivity, being distracted by background noises, right? So we might see avoidance or even negative responses to certain sounds or unexpected sounds, right? So sometimes sounds can trigger this fight or flight. Difficulty holding a conversation, right? That feeling of anxiousness if they're trying to filter out what's important and what's not important. So, and there may be some fear of just everyday objects, the sounds of everyday objects like a blender or a vacuum cleaner. So some things that can be done: noise canceling headphones, and really it should say noise reduction headphones because it doesn't cancel out all of the sound. So if you're having a conversation with someone who has noise reduction headphones on, they can still hear you, but it's just diminishing all of the sound around them. Obviously for older kids, we can use earbuds as well, so they don't have to necessarily be those big bulky headphones. Using a visual timer. So if you're using a timer to help your child move from task to task, rather than using one that dings, just using one that's a visual, is a visual may help with that auditory sensitivity. And then creating a calming space, whether that's in their home or in your home, just in general, or in their bedroom. In classrooms, we call them quiet corners, calm corners, Zen dens, etc. Just where a space for that child to go so that they can calm down. Okay, our tactile friends, those who have sensory sensitivities tactilely. Things that we know, like clothes sensitivity, seams and tags. Oftentimes we see kiddos who have tactile sensitivities be very picky eaters because of all those sensory receptors in the mouth. Same thing with hygiene and self-regulation. So some of the things that we can do is heavy work, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about those proprioceptive supports in just a minute. But messy play activities, but allowing your kid to wear gloves or use scoops, cups, etc., so that they have a little bit of control. And then either using a soft vibration toy or massager or brushing can help reduce some of that tactile sensitivity. Gustatory and olfactory. Again, I put these together because they are so closely linked. Again, what you'll see is that a lot of similar behaviors are across the sensory systems because they are so interrelated and interconnected. When we see a kiddo who is a pretty picky eater, they may be underweight. So as a parent, you just want to have close communication with your child's healthcare provider if you're concerned that your child may be nutritionally deficient. We might see some low muscle tone in the oral structure, which could lead to difficulty with articulation and other verbal communication. There may be some refusal to get their hands messy. That could be a tactile response, but if something has a strong odor, sometimes the scent can linger on our fingers. And then we might see some emotional dysregulation, particularly if a student or a child feels like they may be forced to eat something, or if there's a smell that is overwhelming to them. So food play is really important, right? We know that if a child will touch food with their hands, they're more likely to eat it. We certainly don't want to ever do this at mealtime, particularly if a child is a picky eater. We don't want to increase the anxiety around food. So if we're going to do food play, one, there should never be an expectation for your child to eat it. And we shouldn't do that around mealtime. So meal preparation we want our meal table to be fun and inviting. So meal preparation could be measuring, scooping, pouring, stirring. It doesn't necessarily have to be trying things. And then you may even try some different essential oils or diffusing oils. So you could play a game where your child smells different scents, tells you if they like it or not. And then you can use those scents that they like during challenging situations, right, to help calm that system down. All right, vestibular. Remember, that's that sense of balance. So we see some fearfulness if a child is seated, their feet are off the ground, they're tilted backwards. So think about your child at the dentist and leaning back. That can create a lot of anxiety. Swinging and slides, right? And you may even have your child may avoid those type of activities or engage in behaviors to escape that activity. And so we see some of those difficulties with peers during activities. Then there may be a really strong preference for just sedentary activities overall, which can lead to low muscle tone and endurance. And then how that plays out in school is difficulty with handwriting and other visual motor tasks. So some things that can be done, things like crawling through a tunnel, crawling or going down a hill, climbing up a slide, right? So they're not leaning backwards, jumping on a mini trampoline, using a therapy or an exercise ball to sort of sit on and gently move. Sometimes we even underinflate that ball a little bit. Typically, up and down movements are more tolerable than either backward or spinning movements for kiddos who have vestibular processing difficulties. And then again, interoception is really all about the physiological condition of the body. So we see students who avoid extreme temperatures, again, picky eaters. We might see some struggling with toileting or toilet training because of that, right? Not recognizing or trying to avoid some of those sensory, that feeling. We see big emotions and struggles to self-regulate, hunger and thirst cues, and then pain tolerance or even pain awareness. And we'll talk about some strategies in just a moment. Okay, I want to be mindful of our time. So let's switch our focus. We were talking about sensory avoiders. Now let's talk about when kiddos are seeking out more sensory input and some of the things that we see. And some of these may be very known to you or common to you. So kiddos who are seeking out visual input, they like things that light up and spin and move, and they will stare at those types of things for a long time, right? They may spin themselves, right? Trying to get dizzy. They're looking, they are drawn to really fast acting or fast movement in TV or videos that they're watching. For our auditory sensory seekers, these are kiddos who are seeking out additional noises. So these are our hummers and our singers, kiddos who make noises with their mouths and their bodies all throughout the day. And oftentimes we'll also seek out that vestibular input if they are, if that movement creates any kind of noise. So anytime we hear our name, we're automatically attuned. So in order to filter out excessive noise, using your child's name when you want to get their attention is really important. We want to increase that wait time for a response because, again, they are processing that information. And then using visual supports to increase attention, clarify verbal instructions, right? So that we don't have to stand over our child and say, now do this, now do this, now do this. That visual support can help focus their attention. Kiddos who are tactily hypo-responsive, right? Who are seeking out that tactile input. These are our kids who touch everything. They fidget with anything that they can get their hands on. These may be our kiddos who intentionally crash, right? Who are bumping into things, jumping on things. They engage in a lot of rough play. We call them rough and tumble kids. But at school, it can, we want to be mindful that these are kiddos who can be labeled as bullies because they're seeking a lot of input. So they're engaging with a lot of input. We might see some struggles with fine motor skills, things like handwriting. So they're over gripping their writing utensil, causes hand fatigue, things like self-feeding, dressing. Again, messy eaters because they don't necessarily feel their hands messy or their face is messy with food. Utilizing a variety of textures can help calm that system down. Deep pressure activity, so rolling on a ball or having a ball rolled on top of you, any type of massage, fidget items, weight-bearing activities, so doing things on our hands and knees, non-contact games and activities. So I've linked in here animal walks, but you can really go on YouTube. So it's really just a way to get some of that proprioceptive input, which supports all of our other systems. For our taste and smell sensory seekers, again, these are kiddos who seek out very strong flavors. They like crunchy foods, chewy foods, restricted or resistant foods like taffy or milkshakes. Sometimes, and it's not a pica thing, meaning like they're eating non-edibles to eat non-edibles, but they might put things in their mouths that are not edible because of the texture or the crunch, things like that. They have a strong preference for certain smells, or they may underreact to other smells. And as you can imagine, that may be very dangerous if, typically if we smell a chemical, we react and we don't ingest it. But if I have, if I'm a sensory seeker and a chemical smells good to me, I may then ingest it. So we want to be careful about that. And so a visual cue we might use is just an X or a no or a stop on our cabinets that have those chemicals that we don't want our kids to get into. Using scented objects or smelling jars, replacement objects like gum or mints, adding any type of strong fruit, lemon, lime, raspberry to water can support that sensory system. Constant movement for our vestibular kiddos. Remember, those inputs are in the ear. And so these are kiddos who are always moving. They will spin and they don't ever seem to get dizzy. They love to swing and slide and jump, and they're seeking out these types of activities. So some alternative seating, so things like a wiggle seat or a therapy ball or an exercise ball, just even a different texture on carpet or hardwood or tile can provide some of that vestibular input. But if they get a little bit of movement in there, that helps as well. And then proprioceptive input, things like setting up an obstacle course, in your backyard or in the park, just to provide opportunities to run and jump and crash, especially for our younger kiddos. With these types of activities, it's incredibly important to have a start and a stop. So we want to do an activity that allows for that sensory input, complete that activity, and then be done. Otherwise, we could really get ourselves into some trouble with not being able to stop an activity when we need to move on. And then interoception, for our kiddos who are seeking that type of input, opposite of those kiddos who are hyper responsive. So these are kiddos who seek out extreme temperatures. They like it extremely cold or extremely hot. They may eat until they are overfull because, again, they don't have that trigger or that receptor in the body that says you've had enough to eat. We may see struggles with toileting, right? They may hold particularly bowel movements. We see a lot of risk-taking behavior, again, to get that input into their body. And very similar to those who are hyper-responsive, we see big emotions and struggles to self-regulate. So I gave just a variety of strategies for each sensory system, but I really want to spend the next few minutes talking about proprioceptive input. It's uncommon for anyone to sort of avoid proprioceptive input. These are great activities to calm the system, but honestly, these are great equalizers because those who need to alert a system, proprioceptive inputs also allow for that. So it's kind of a 2-for-1. I can calm a system, I can alert a system by doing proprioceptive input. So I often, when I talk with teachers, I tell them, hey, if you're gonna do any type of strategy, look at these proprioceptive strategies first. And we know that it has a positive impact on learning, on behavior, and attention. Now, I will say I'm not an occupational therapist. These strategies are often used by OTs, and many of these I have gotten because I have worked with incredible OTs over many years. Some of these strategies are used with kiddos who do have sensory processing deficits and disorders, sometimes as a larger intervention approach. But most people can benefit from these strategies. These are what we call heavy work. Again, not an exhaustive list, but just many things to provide some thoughts for you. Typically, any activity that's going to involve pushing, pulling, carrying, weight bearing, that's going to be considered a proprioceptive activity. So things that you can do around the house, having your child carry grocery sacks, gardening or yard work, blowing bubbles, right? And as you're hearing these things and thinking about them, thinking about how they support those different sensory systems. Instead of using a pencil, like a mechanical pencil sharpener, using a handheld or a manual, get some of that input as well. Doing things like pushing against the wall, either in front or having your kids stand against the wall and have their hands back, pushing against the wall, pushing their hands together provides a lot of input. Sometimes I'll take a kid's hands and put them in between mine if they can handle it tactily and just squeeze their hands like that. Doing chair push-ups, just right there in your chair. A kid can do that very easily once they're taught how to do that. Again, animal walks are a great way to get that input. So you can hop like a bunny or gallop like a horse. If you've got space, you might slither like a snake, etc. When you're out and about, having your kid open the door and hold the door open. So whether that's at a store, or at church, or your place of worship, doing that, get some of that input into the joints and muscles. Anything that you do outside, whether it's playground equipment, you don't have to go out and buy anything to support your kiddos proprioceptively. You can literally go to your school playground or the neighborhood playground, go to the track, take a family walk, hopscotch, all of those things are going to provide that proprioceptive input. When you're thinking about snacks for your kiddos, again, those crunchy, those chewy, those resistive foods, gums, mints, using those swirly or crazy straws, or using coffee stirrers, which requires more force through the mouth to get the water through those little, through the small openings. And then any type of weight-bearing activity. So if your kid is going to color or draw or do a puzzle, having them on their hands and knees, laying or rolling over a therapy ball or on their stomach provides lots of input. For our older kids, if they have homework or they have to journal, they can do that on the floor as well. Crawling through a tunnel, pushing a ball, any type of fidget. So lots of different proprioceptive activities. Okay. I know I just have a few minutes left. So ultimately, the way you choose to intervene with your child, or as you know, that we choose to intervene with students, really depends on a lot of factors, right? Our cultural norms, our past experiences, the relationship that we have with our child. But there are a couple of things that I hope that you keep in mind when you're thinking about your intervention and your response. We want to be empathetic. We want to be non-judgmental. We want to recognize our own fears and anxieties, right? What are some of the things that cause us to respond inappropriately, our sensory preferences? And are we recognizing that our child is in distress? And what are they trying to communicate with that? We always want to respect personal space. We want to be, particularly if our student is having a sensory response, right? We want to think about our position and our posture. When we allow for personal space, that shows that we respect our child, but it also can decrease the anxiety that may be coming along with those sensory responses. We want to keep our emotional brains in check, right? So again, remember we talked about feeling frustrated and angry when we have behaviors that are challenging to us. When we can remain calm and rational, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can control our child's behavior, but our response can absolutely have a direct impact on our child's behavior, whether it escalates or de-escalates. When we want to listen to what our child is telling us, verbally, non-verbally, through their behaviors and their actions. And ultimately, we need to set limits, right? We want to give clear, simple, and enforceable limits, right? Giving choices and consequences. So that's where we go back to that start and stop, particularly for those who are seeking a lot of sensory input. And then those last two, choosing what we insist upon and then allowing silence for reflection, right? There's typically only one hill that we can die on. We want to be thoughtful about that hill that we're going to die on, right? What are some things that are negotiable? What are not? Where can we offer our child options and be flexible so that we might be able to avoid some unnecessary altercations? And then silence is a great communication tool. Oftentimes our kiddos can reflect on what they need, and that's our goal. Is we don't always want to be the one saying, do this, do this. We can put language to it. Does your body looks like it needs to move? Do you need to do A, B, or C? So that our children can start recognizing their sensory needs and advocating for what they need in ways that are not going to cause disruptions, right? We want them to get those needs met, but not engage in behavior that will cause them to get in trouble, cause disruption for your home or the classroom. So that was a lot of information, very, very fast. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen again. Here's my contact information. If you have, if you need any information or need anything clarified, I am more than happy to share anything that I've got with you.
Andrea, thank you so much for really just fantastic information and wonderful tips. We do have some questions. As a reminder, if you're joining us on Zoom, if you will put your questions in the Q&A box, it will be easier for us to find all of those instead of the chat. If you're joining us on Facebook, you can put your questions in the comments. So we do have several questions. So our first question, what are some good ways to tell differences between something that could be kind of a personality quirk and a preference and sensory responsiveness?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's a hard question. I think it's a little bit of trial and error, right? It's really about being a detective and sort of having a hypothesis of what you think is going on, trying a strategy. We can see if that escalates or de-escalates a response, and then trying something else, right? But I think it's a little bit of trial and error and knowing your kiddo and really having good communication, right? Because some of the behaviors that we might see at school, parents might not see at home just because of the needs and the things that happen at school are different than that happen at home, and vice versa. So that good homeschool collaboration is really important, I think.
Absolutely. All right. I think this question came from a professional. How can you balance when you have a child that is hypersensitive, and then you have a child that is sensory seeking that are together?
Yeah, I think that particularly in our classrooms, that is the question. So one, I think our kids know that we can set up environments for kiddos to have safe spaces. So sometimes that's in the classroom. Sometimes there are other places in the school where kiddos know that they can go. I think when we are honoring of all of those different needs and kids see that we honor those needs, then they recognize, okay, I have strategies that I can use that can calm me down here, or I can go to these different places. But if it's always, this is always the way it's going to be, my teacher won't help me, I don't have any way to escape, then we're going to see big behaviors. So I think just honoring the different needs of kiddos and putting language to it, so that kids can start advocating for themselves, right? We meet our sensory needs all the time as adults, right? If we're at work in the office, we get up and we go get a drink, we go get coffee, we go talk to our colleagues. If we're thinking about our kiddos past grade 3 or 7th grade and thinking about how they're going to be as an adult, then we want to start teaching them how to independently advocate for themselves in a way that's going to get their needs met, that won't be disruptive to them or to their classmates and friends.
Excellent. Oh, we've got some great questions. Any suggestions for how parents can deal with a child who they mask all day at school, and then the moment their parent picks them up, they lose control?
Yeah. One, I mean, how brave of that kid to hold all of that together all day long, and really they should be commended for using all of that energy. I think a couple of things. One is setting up some activities that the kid can do immediately when they get home, just to either calm their system down or alert their system in a way that will then help them do homework or take a bath or eat dinner. But I would also work very closely with your child's teacher to say, okay, how can we incorporate some sensory supports throughout the day? Again, these can be done very easily. Kids don't have to leave the classroom to get these inputs, so that kids aren't holding it together all day long and then sort of erupting the moment they walk out of the school building.
Absolutely. And we had somebody with a comment in the chat that some parents have had some success giving their kids a snack right away in the car. So great tip.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the question is, if there is an adult with a disability that has sensory issues and they need to undergo a surgery on their eyes, will that affect their sensory processing and integration skills after the surgery? So, maybe they're having an artificial lens or something like that. Would that affect their sensory after the surgery?
That's an interesting question. I'm certainly no neuroscientist. but our I don't know that our sensory receptors are retrained. But that's an interesting question. I don't know. I would have to do a little bit of research, but that is a fantastic question.
All right. So any suggestions for a student in a general education classroom in high school that hums and that is soothing for the student, but could be distracting to the other students in the classroom?
Yeah. So oftentimes students who are needing that auditory input, they don't even recognize that they're making noise. And sometimes it sounds like this, you said high school. So that may have been a strategy that was taught to that child when they were young to help self-soothe or self-regulate. And it's just followed them. So one, let's just talk to the kid, right? Hey, do you recognize that you're doing this? What do you need when you're doing this? And then brainstorming with that kid, that teenager, about what are some other ways that you think you might get that need met. We may have some ideas, but it always is going to be better if we talk to the child, regardless of what age they are, to get their input and their buy-in.
Absolutely. We've got a couple of questions related to like diagnosing and assessing. And so if a parent suspects that their child may have some sensory issues or even be on the autism spectrum, who could they go to for an evaluation? What age? And then who could they go to for support after the evaluation?
Yeah. So your school can always provide an evaluation. There are a couple of questions that we have to ask in terms of evaluation. School evaluators, even if they are doctors, do not diagnose in the school setting. We determine eligibility for services. And that's a little bit different than a medical diagnosis. If you're looking for a medical diagnosis, that comes from a medical professional, a doctor. And families sometimes choose to go that route, and they can take that information to the school, and the school will still want to do their own type of evaluation or review of that information, because there are some legal requirements that schools have with regard to providing services for a student. And then if a student has been evaluated in a school setting for services, whether that's special education services or 504 services, the school people can help with that. There are lots of incredible professionals in the world, and families are more than welcome to go to those people. But your school systems are filled with amazing people who provide support in school and as a wraparound service, like in-home and parent training support, that are free, and certainly would be, my first, if I were a parent of a child and I was concerned, my school would be the first spot I would go to.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of our time for today, so we're going to get wrap up. Once again, I just want to say thank you, Andrea, for this wealth of information that you shared with us. Such great information and wonderful tips. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you all for joining us. I'm going to share my screen one more time, and we're going to go ahead and wrap up. So once again, thank you all for joining us. And just as a reminder, this was recorded. Our webinar was recorded today. And so you can check out our recorded webinar on our website at prntexas.org and also on our Facebook page. And again, for those of you that need a certificate of attendance, you will be receiving an email to thank you for attending today's webinar. You can follow the link in that email and get your certificate of attendance. We do have one final webinar coming up for our spring semester. On May 7th at 12:15, we have strategies and tips to avoid the summer slide with Dr. Michelle Simmons from West Texas A&M University. So be sure and register and check that one out for lots of great tips for parents to help avoid the summer slide. On the screen is our contact information for our Director of Statewide Services, Christina, our support specialist, Chelsea, and myself. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions, and please be sure and check out our website at prntexas.org for information on upcoming webinars and events in your regions, as well as lots of information for parents. You can also like and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PRN Texas. And thank you again for joining us. And Andrea and all of you wonderful ladies at Region 10 Education Service Center, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.